You're listening to Lexington Community Radio, WLXU 93.9, and this is Bike Talk.
Hi, I'm your host, Wanda Bertram. Today we're talking about a bill before the Kentucky State Legislature. This bill regards how to safely overtake bicycles on our roadways. And with us to discuss this important bill is Pam Thomas. She's the president for the Bluegrass Cycling Club. Dixie Moore, she's the primary citizen advocate for this bill. And Don Stosberg, he's a BCC club member, he's a ride leader, and he's president of Walk Bike Frankfurt. Everyone, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
I'm so glad you all are here to talk about this. And first, let's hear from Pam about her thoughts on this bill and why it's so important.
I am also a league certified instructor, which is a person who is certified by the League of American Bicyclists to teach people how to ride safely on the roads. And so in that capacity and being involved in both group rides and also commuting to and from work between Midway and Frankfurt for several years, I've had a lot of experiences on the road in different circumstances with different kinds of vehicles and different people. And I think the importance of this bill is the education aspect of it and the fact that when we have this law, drivers can know that they're supposed to give cyclists 3 feet if possible and to pass safely. And also, I think it's important for drivers to know that cyclists have equal right to be on the road. And so, I know that some of the complaints about this are that it's not enforceable, but there are a lot of laws that aren't quote unquote enforceable, but still serve a valid purpose, which is education of the public and for people to understand and be aware. And I think that the more that we can do to facilitate communication and cooperation between cyclists and motorists, the better off everybody will be, both the motorist and the cyclist. And one other thing I want to mention about this bill that I think is really important is that right now, if a cyclist is and a motorist are on the road going in the same direction and there's a double yellow line, legally, the motorist cannot cross that double yellow line to pass a cyclist. But what this bill allows is that if it's clear and you've made sure that it's clear, you can go ahead and do that for the purpose of passing a cyclist. So I think that's important, that it gives drivers permission to do that. But I applaud Dixie for her continued efforts many years, and I'm so grateful she's doing what she's doing.
All right, Pam, thank you so much for joining us today. And we're going to hear from Dixie more about the specifics of that bill. But first, Dixie, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what your role is in this process?
Well, my role is that I'm a rider with the Bluegrass Cycling Club. And about 3 years ago, I saw a bumper sticker that said, give 3 feet when passing a bike. And I said, oh, I never knew that. And then I went to my computer and I found out that that was not the law in Kentucky. And so I remember talking to Pam 3 years ago about saying, hey, I bet maybe the Kentucky legislature could pass that. I didn't think it would take 3 years, and it's not a done deal yet. This is just the first hurdle, but it's an important one. And so I have friends who have been hurt. I have friends who no longer ride because they've been hurt. I have friends who have been killed, and I have been scared to death on the roads. So I don't want to make our roads not rideable for cyclists. I want us all to share the roads. And as Pam said, the law might not be enforceable in the sense that you have to have a policeman to watch it in order to cite it. And oftentimes what happens on the road, the policeman is not there. But just like the seatbelt laws help people wear seatbelts, as soon as it got passed, people started wearing seatbelts. I think that this law will have a similar effect, and it gives a good platform to have a public service campaign on it.
Wonderful. Very valid points. So let's talk a little bit, Dixie, about the legislative process and what's going on right now. What is the climate like? You've talked a little bit about this. You've been working on this 3 years. It's a long time. You've been very diligent.
Well, thank you. The cyclists and their representatives in urban areas and suburban areas tend to be more for the bill just because there are more cyclists in their communities. They see them more, they're around more. Statistically, most deaths and injuries happen in urban and suburban areas. However, the opposition to the bill seems to come from rural interests where their experience is a recreational cyclist whom they see as perhaps getting in the way of their going to work, making the road unsafe. However, again, the fatalities that happen are in the suburban and in the more populated areas. But we have to sort of bring people, we have to educate people as to how one should be on the road. Most people, if you ask them face to face, says, I'm very comfortable with a cyclist being on the road. I'll give them distance. But then if you start talking to them, then they'll come up with the poor example, where somebody did not get over, where maybe somebody who had a horse trailer with some very expensive horses in it felt like that cyclist was endangering them pulling their horse trailer and the horses inside. So there is education to be done on both sides.
On the part of both drivers, vehicular drivers, and cyclists.
Correct.
Yeah, and that includes educating the legislators that you have been working with. Can you talk about that legislative process and where you are right now?
It passed the House Transportation Committee, which means that it now has the okay to be heard by the entire House. Kentucky has two chambers, the House and the Senate. Hopefully it will pass the House, and then it will go over to the Senate, where it will go through a Senate committee, and if it passes that committee, it will be heard in the Senate. And I asked Don to be here today because he's sort of a representative of a club, both of the BCC and of Frankfurt Bike Walk. The way that this bill has gotten this far is that I have been able to network through Facebook, the internet, club sites with clubs to get them to call their legislator as their constituent and to explain why this bill is so important. I could not have done what I did without the backing of club members picking up their phone and calling their legislator when I put out the word to, hey, now is the time to talk to this particular person. Because legislators vote because they want votes, and it's important for them to know how their constituency, the people who live in their district, stand.
And Don, can you tell me a little bit about your role in this and how you fit in?
I just wanted to add on to what Dixie has said. I am also, it wasn't mentioned earlier, but I'm also a former staff member of the legislature, and I've followed the legislative process for a long time. And many bills do take a number of times to come through the session. And having a person like Dixie, who has bird dogged this bill for a number of years, makes a big difference. And I, having watched this process for a long time, feel like it will get through the other steps because the Senate is already familiar with the bill. So I think we have a very good chance of passing the bill.
That's excellent. And we're also going to hear from State Representative Jerry Miller. He is the primary sponsor of this bill, about the importance of advocacy as well. And then we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned in. Representative Miller, you're the primary sponsor for this bill. We want to thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. It's, Kentucky is one of only 8 states that lacks a law like this. It's common sense. We have probably an average of 6 or 7 fatalities a year. And if this can reduce one a year, one every 5 years, it's a good thing. And I'm really happy to be able to be the lead sponsor on this. And if any of your listeners want to call their representatives and senators and encourage them to vote for this bill, I'd appreciate it, and it'd be very helpful.
Thank you so much, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram, and today we're talking about a bill before the Kentucky legislature, and it regards how to safely overtake bicycles on our roadway. And with us is Dixie Moore. She's the primary citizen advocate for this bill, and Don Stosberg. He's a Bluegrass Cycling Club member. He's a ride leader, and he's president of Walk Bike Frankfurt. So, Don, you have a lot of legislative experience, and you've shared some of that with us, but this bill is also important to you personally.
Yes, I've been cycling about maybe 15 years. And when you talk tell people you're a cyclist, one of the first things that often comes up is, do you feel safe? Or people might respond, I don't feel safe on the road. So anything we can do to make a cyclist feel safer, we have increased the opportunity for cycling, which is healthy and good and an alternative transportation. So I think this bill is going to go a long way toward making people feel safer in the long run. And you never know what you prevent, but we're very likely going to prevent some accidents by increasing driver awareness with the 3-foot passing law.
Well, and awareness on the part of cyclists too, I would think.
Yes, very awareness on the part of cyclists. I mean, some people have mirrors on their helmets. Some people have mirrors on their bikes. It's one of the things you watch about, you look at when you're cycling, is how close is a vehicle to you.
Yeah. So, Dixie, with all of that in mind, can you tell us a little bit more about the bill? Is there a precedent for this bill?
Yes, I modeled it after the League of American Cyclists model bill. It took it verbatim practically. And 34 states have a bill that has a 3-foot passing law or greater. Some states have 4 to 5 feet. Because if you're going fast, then you'll take up more room if you fall. So 3 foot is really a minimum standard. And only 8 states have anything that is less stringent than Kentucky. In other words, we are at the bottom in terms of our law. In fact, we're right 49th in terms of our bike laws by the League of American Cyclists.
Well, and I would think that affects the state of Kentucky in several ways, not just from a safety perspective, but tourism.
Yes, it makes us less attractive as a tourist destination for cyclists. And there are many tours, there are many events through Kentucky. The Horsey 100, which is headquartered in Georgetown and, brings in 2,000 riders over a weekend, puts something like $600,000 into Scott County's economy for that weekend. So it is a big driver. And one of the groups of supporters for this bill are what are called trail towns in eastern Kentucky, in the mountains, in rural areas, who are trying to get more tourism, and cycling tourism is a big mix of that.
So, Dixie, let's talk about some of the specifics of this bill. There are 4 elements to it, I believe.
Right. First element is that if there is an adjacent lane, say you have 2 lanes on a road, either going in the same direction or going in the opposite direction, take the adjacent lane to pass if it's there. If there's not an adjacent lane, then pass with a clearance of 3 feet. Now, rural interests were concerned about having large farm machinery that could not possibly stay on the road and also pass the cyclist if they gave 3 feet. And so an accommodation was made to them in the wording this year that if there is not room to give 3 feet on the roadway, and the roadway means from the edge of the pavement to the edge of the pavement, if there is not room on the roadway to give 3 feet, then to use reasonable caution, which we felt was an appropriate accommodation to the rural interest in order to get the bill passed. However, this bill without that type of accommodation seems to be working fine in Tennessee, Arkansas, West Virginia, and I follow the news on the internet. There seems to be no dislike of the bill because of that. But anyway, give 3 feet. Then the next clause is that a motorist can now cross, if the bill passes, becomes law, can cross a double yellow line to pass a cyclist. When double yellow lines came in, or no passing zones, the expectation was that you should be able to see far enough around that you could pass another vehicle, another car, going slightly below the speed limit. In other words, the distance on a no passing zone area would have been safe for a car, say, going 45 miles an hour. Well, a cyclist on a road typically only goes maybe 12 to 15. So we're smaller, we go slower, there's much more ability to look around. And so the common practice on our roads is that motorcyclists do go over the yellow line to pass a cyclist. motorist goes over the yellow line. And I think this will make it easier for motorists to follow the law because now the law accommodates what is common, safe usage.
So a lot of these practices, such as that one, is one that it was already in existence.
Yes, but illegal.
But illegal.
The other thing that's always been in existence, and in the driver's manual, it encourages you to carpool and to use alternate transportation and to ride bikes, okay? Because they're concerned about how congested and polluted and how our roads get, used very roughly with transportation. And the driver's manual recommends a 3-foot passing distance. But it's hard to get a teenager to look at what the driver manual recommends on page 62. And so we would like to have it law so that we can say that it is a law, just like seatbelt law and a texting law is.
And there are other parts of this bill as well.
The other part is that there are things called sharrows on the roads, which are the emblem of a bike that you might see on a road. They're usually in towns. And when that emblem is on the road, that means that the cyclist cannot necessarily does not have to stay completely over to the right. Because on an urban street, there are parked cars and you can get what is called doored. In other words, somebody can open a door and basically knock you off your bike, or there might be a hole, or there's a gutter or a culvert, so you can go over into the road to travel safely. And some cyclists feel that taking the lane, as it is called, is really a safety maneuver when the cyclist sees that it's unsafe to pass. It's not that they're being obstructive and saying, hey, I got the road and you can't pass me, but the cyclist is ahead and maybe they see some type of danger and therefore they stay in the roadway.
Yes, having been there, that's absolutely necessary sometimes to get around those kinds of obstacles, isn't it, Don?
Yes. I wanted to comment some more on what Dixie said. I think is an important point in this bill. There's really not an us and them when we come to cyclists and motorists. We're all in this together, but there are some people that think when we do something for cyclists, it's anti-motorist. And what I think is an important compromise or element or addition in this bill is the part that allows a driver to cross the double yellow line when it's reasonable to get around a cyclist. Because that way it's something that's really protecting the motorist from getting in legal trouble for crossing the double yellow line. It's a very good addition to the bill and shows that we're working together with all parties.
So it's actually protective of vehicular drivers as well, not just cyclists.
Yes, that was the point I was trying to make, is that this is playing to everybody's interest. And that's what you have to do to get bills passed sometimes, but it's also a good thing because we're all working together here.
Yeah, that's an important part of the legislative process.
Yes.
All right. Well, we're going to take another short break. We'll be back in a few moments, so stay tuned in. Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram. Today we're talking about a bill. This bill regards how to safely overtake bicycles on our roadway. And with us is Dixie Moore. She's the primary citizen advocate that's been pushing this bill for 3 years now. And we also have with us Don Stosberg. He's a Bluegrass Cycling Club member, a ride leader, and he's president of Walk Bike Frankfurt. So Dixie, let's talk about some of the concerns and objections that you faced with this bill over the last 3 years.
One, that it would make no difference. And that goes into, is it enforceable, which I'll talk about later. To really make biking safer, we have to have separate biking facilities. In other words, bike lanes. But it is impractical to have bike lanes on all our roads tomorrow. It's probably impractical to have bike lanes on all our roads in 20 years because we have rural areas where there aren't very many people. So the next step is to make our laws so that as people who ride bicycles and who drive cars, because I do both and most people do both, that we have some sort of standard in our head as to how to interact with one another. And this is what that bill does. But that's a concern that, it's not going to be worth anything. Big one is that it's not enforceable. Technically, it is. You can have laser things put in your handlebars that will tell you how far you are from a car. So theoretically, we could have sort of like a policeman could go down on his bike and say, oops, you got too close. You were within my 3-foot limit. So it technically is enforceable, but
Not practically.
yeah, it wouldn't be. So,
But we've heard again, that's true of many, many laws.
right. I think that the unknown probably is part of it. That if you live in a rural community where you know everybody on the roads and then all of a sudden you see a strange cyclist, it's like they don't belong here. And I think as we become more into alternate transportation, where we have more slower vehicles on the roads, including bikes. By the way, the Amish were a big supporter of this bill because their students, their school-aged children, ride bikes to school. And this law also can be a beginning of a law toward what's called vulnerable users. We might have more vulnerable users on our roads, which would include horses, bikes, people in wheelchairs. So the roads are meant for everyone, not just for motorists.
Thank you. Don, you were in the House hearing when the House met about this bill and voted on this bill. What were some of the comments that you heard in the House committee hearing?
Well, one representative from Louisville mentioned that he had been treated rudely by a cyclist where she was taking up the lane and then she gave him a signal that wasn't that very nice. And we have to admit, as cyclists, we have rude people among cyclists as there are rude people among drivers. Fortunately, that representative ended up voting for the bill, so I hope he's forgiven her and us. We all have to be polite to one another. Another representative mentioned that the bill isn't enforceable, and I think he meant in the sense of passing out tickets for anybody who gets in 2.5 feet of a cyclist. And we're really not in trying to accomplish that with this bill. We're trying to educate people about the importance of giving a wide berth, how important that is to cyclists and to motorists, because it's not only the cyclist that's going to suffer if we have an accident, the motorist is going to have a big insurance bill and a lawsuit on their hands if they end up injuring somebody. So this is in everybody's interest to make things as safe as possible. This representative also mentioned the cost of the bill, which a fiscal note of $10,000 to $15,000. Well, most of us that are familiar with state government know that $10,000 to $15,000 is pocket change in state government, and that's not really a significant cost. It might be things like the cost of printing an extra question on the driver's test or an alternative question. So I don't think the cost is really significant. And then we had a representative made a very interesting comment that points up the charity work that cyclists do. He had a son who had traveled across America and raised money, I believe it was for cancer research.
Alzheimer's research, yeah.
And raised a significant amount of money. And many cyclists participate in events like that raise money for charity. So that's another reason for cycling to be encouraged and supported. I'll make one other comment that we didn't have, I don't think we had any no votes, but we had 2 passes on the bill. And the bill has to have a unanimous vote in the House to go on the consent calendar. So it's not going to be in the consent calendar, which means they'll take a formal vote on the bill. But there's not likely to be too many no votes in the House. But it will get a full debate if it's needed when it comes to the House.
So the bill has to go before the House. And once it passes the House, assuming it does, what happens to the bill then? They
literally carry it over to the Senate, and it is assigned to a committee. In this case, it's pretty clearly transportation. So it'll be passed. It'll be very likely sent to the Transportation Committee. And the chairman usually has a great influence on whether the bill is heard. But I understand from Dixie, but this chairman has supported the bill in the past. So we think it's very likely to get a good hearing in the Senate. And since it had passed the Senate in prior sessions, many senators are already familiar with the legislation. So as an observer of the process, I'm feeling fairly good that it will have a good chance of coming out of the Senate. It's technically possible that the governor could veto it, but I can't imagine the governor would veto a bill like this with this kind of support. It's not the kind of thing that he would probably get involved in.
And Don, how important is advocacy to this process?
advocacy is very important, and people speaking up and people calling their legislators. And I think that's one reason the bill came out of the committee very well. Dixie's done a good job of keeping the cyclists informed about the status of the bill. And I'm sure there are many legislators who know cyclists, and generally, we're a good bunch of people and we get respect. And one other point I would make, I think the culture is changing in regard to cycling. Cycling, in my opinion, is becoming more popular, more accepted, and motorists are getting more accepting of cyclists on the road. And this is changing slowly, but I think this is helping get more acceptance for this type of bill.
And Dixie, so are you sensing that as well, that you're seeing more acceptance as you've worked through the last 3 years getting this bill?
One, they recognize me. They know me, the legislator. But yes, I think people are becoming more accepting of cyclists. I think there are a couple of studies that say when cyclists are on the road tends to be safer because one, people slow down, they look more, they aren't so much on automatic. And I want to put in a plug for everyone who wants to see safer passing laws to call the legislative hotline. You don't even have to know who your representative is. All you have to do is call up and say, I want to ask my representative to vote yes on this particular bill, House Bill 33, and they'll look it up for you, okay? And the number is 800-372-7181. That's the legislative hotline. Please call it and register that you want your legislator to vote positive on House Bill 33.
Yeah, and in the House hearing in the Transportation Committee where it passed, there was a good turnout. Did that impact what happened, do you think, Don?
Definitely. When legislators see a lot of people in the room, they know there's an interest in the bill. Of course, we didn't have every pro-cyclist person with a cyclist jersey on there, but I think they knew there was a fair number of cyclists there, and that does have an impact. I've seen that many times.
So the phone calls and the vocal presence makes a difference, Dixie.
Definitely. And I thanked everyone profusely who turned up because if you've got enough interest to travel 30 miles, 2 hours, coming from Louisville to Frankfurt, that's giving your day to come in and sit in this room. That speaks a lot to the legislature.
All right. Well, it's time for another break. We'll be back with you in a few moments. Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram, and we are talking about a bill that regards how to safely overtake bicycles on your roadways. And with us is Dixie Moore. She is the citizen advocate that has been behind this bill, driving it for the last 3 years. And Don Stosberg, he's a Bluegrass Cycling Club member. He's a ride leader, and he's president of Walk Bike Frankfurt. So Dixie, let's talk a little bit about public awareness. We said that this bill, its primary purpose necessarily isn't enforcement. It's about public awareness and education. How will that happen, do you think?
Assuming the bill gets passed, assuming it becomes a law, then I think all the cycling clubs will put out notices that this is a law. But better than the cycling clubs, it's going to be the transportation departments where you go to get your driver's license. Hopefully there'll be banners on the wall or posters on the wall saying give 3 feet. Again, it can be a question on a driver's test. It'll just become part of our everyday understanding about how to travel on a road. Everybody in Kentucky who drives knows that you can turn left at certain places from one-way streets, or I assume they do, assuming that in time, this will become that type of knowledge that people will just have. But you have to teach it first. And there is something called the Paul & I grants, which can be instrumental in this. Most of you all have seen Share the Road license plates. Well, the money that goes to buy a Share the Road license plate is what funds the Paul & I grants. And probably last year, I think maybe $80,000 was given out in Paul & I grants to cycling efforts and initiatives. And I can see Paul & I grants going toward a public service campaign to put this out so that the public can learn about it. So buy a license plate, call your legislator, and follow the new law.
And there are some organizations out there that could impact public awareness as well, I think.
Yes, there's something called the Kentucky Bike and Bikeway Commission. It's an appointed commission by the governor that advises the transportation department on things relevant to cycling. And they are the ones who determine who get the Paul and I grant. So they're going to be very instrumental in this. And they also have ways to put out public notices and announcements to the public. There's going to be a statewide bikeway event. I've forgotten what the technical name of it is, but it's going to be all statewide organizations involved in cycling are going to have a meeting sponsored by the Bikeway Commission sometime in the spring in Lexington. And I'm sure there'll be a big topic on how to get out the public awareness of this bill. Something that's been in the works that really hasn't happened yet is a nonprofit educational organization that would be devoted to making Kentucky more bike friendly, making Kentucky more bike safe. Other states have these types of nonprofits. Basically, I'm just one person who got cycling clubs to back me on going after this law. But things could move a lot faster, not necessarily politically, but in an education ways, if there was a nonprofit statewide that would coordinate the efforts. So hopefully that might happen.
So there's some structural things that we can be doing as a community of cyclists and as a state, even as we go forward, to improve our ability to take advantage of these kinds of changes.
Yes, most definitely.
And then, Dawn, at a practical side, at the community level, how do you see this bill, once it becomes law, playing out? What are some things that local communities can do, such as yours?
Well, we in Walk Like Frankfort, we have a board that meets regularly, and then we have general membership meetings a couple times a year. At those general membership meetings, we can remind people that a new law has been passed and it requires motorists to give you 3-foot leeway as they pass around. So there are different things we can do it at our meetings, but we recently printed some bike maps for our local community. We can put a line on there that says there's a statute that requires 3-foot passing when a motorist passes a bike. There are different things like that we can do. When we do education of kids about cycling, we could mention it. So I want to echo Dixie's support of the law. It only costs like an extra $12.50. Is that correct? For cycling, share the road license plate, and it's a very attractive license plate. It's got a red and blue cyclist and a runner on it. So it'll make your car look better.
It really is a beautiful plate. I get compliments all over the country when I travel about that plate.
It is very well designed. And every little bit adds up to $80,000 to $100,000 that's spread around the state to them for grants for cycling safety. Paul and I was one of the original staff members in Transportation Cabinet to begin to work on statewide bike ped issues. And she left us a number of years ago, and they named the grant after her.
So has Walk Bike Frankfort, have you all applied for or used the Paul and I grants?
We've used the Paul and I grant. I'm pretty sure we got one to support our nonprofit bike shop, which repaired bikes for kids who didn't have bikes or people who didn't have bikes. We also did got one for an educational safety awareness seminar for the local police force. And I think we did a couple others, which I don't remember. But any community bike club or community organization is eligible to apply for Paul and I grants if there's some group out there that's interested in this topic.
So these kinds of grants, Dixie, can go a long way in communities helping promote this bill.
Correct.
Well, let's talk about some of the benefits, the additional benefits of this bill with the little time left that we have remaining. Dixie, do you think there's going to be an economic impact on this state?
Yes, I do. One, it makes it much more attractive for touring cyclists who often are referred to as wallets on bikes. And so bringing money into the state is good. Keeping money into the state is good. And so, yes, I think every bike shop that I approached is very much for this bill because basically they see an increase of selling bikes. And one bike shop even helped me out by, printing up some bumper stickers that I could give out to legislators and supporters. There are 4 United States bike routes that can or are crossing Kentucky. One has just been signed going from east to west. It's called the US 76. And there's a race on it every year where people go from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean somewhere, self-supported, and who can get there fastest. All right. So I have heard comments that they have recently seen signs in Kentucky. They come through down near western Kentucky, come across the bottom tier, and then go out through Ashland. So there's also something called the Underground Railway bike trail that's going to happen. That's going to go up through Maysville, leave Tennessee, go up through Maysville. So Kentucky, just like it's a hub of transportation for trucks and heavy equipment, we also are a crossroads for bike roads. So we can have a lot of touring traffic here in Kentucky if we desire it, and this will make it much more desirable.
And there's also environmental and health benefits that to me seem very obvious. I think.
I've been a rider for 15, 20 years. And the one big reason why I ride is that it keeps my arthritis down. You know, the constant rhythmical movement of cycling. When I first started to bike, I said I bike to eat because you could eat more. But in 2010, approximately 30% of Kentucky was obese. Okay. We meet the obesity requirements. So anything that increases physical exercise, a more healthy lifestyle is good, and cycling is part of that. A more active population has fewer medical costs, is more productive, and is healthy.
So going back as we close off the show, advocacy is extremely important to this bill, to let your state legislators know that you support this bill and to contact them. Dixie, how do they do that again?
Well, one easy way is to call the legislative hotline, which is 800-372-7181. They'll ask you for your name and where you live because they want to know whose district you live in. And they'll ask you for your message and who you want to give it to. And you can give it to numerous people. You could say, I want it to go to the entire House. You can say, I want it to go to this committee, or I want it to go to these 3 people. And then they will pass that message on. Another way is by email. Many of the times that I contacted legislatures, I did it through email, and we would have this sort of email correspondence. And typically, I would say 95% of their addresses are first name dot last name, the @ and then lrc.ky.gov. And you can send off emails and get responses back. It's amazing what texting and emailing has done. It's allowed us to have a lot more contact with our public officials than before.
Very important.
I would also mention that the legislature has an excellent website which has the legislative record on it. And if your listeners want to follow the status of the bill, just look for the legislative record at the Kentucky Legislature website and look up House Bill 33, and every day it'll update the status of that bill. So they can see at that site when it's going to be voted on in the House and when it's going to come up in committee in the Senate. So that's an excellent way to track the status of the bill.
So this is a call to action to let your legislators know what you think. And let's all get this bill passed into law together. And that's all the time we have for today's show. So I'd like to thank our guests, Dixie and Don, again for their time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And don't forget to tune in to Bike Talk at the same time next week for all things cycling, helping you get out, explore our towns and countryside in Lexington and beyond. Thanks for joining us. Be safe and enjoy the ride.